Friends, today is Saturday, March 22, 2025, last day of the week for our study of self-control. And we've learned a lot about self-control. I hope you followed the study this week. And today we take a verse for 1 Corinthians 6:12. And this has to do with the way in which the mastery of physical desires and appetites has a spillover effect. And this idea was very common among the desert fathers. So Evagrius was an interesting person. He was friends with some of the leading Trinitarian theologians who helped to develop the creeds that we have become substantial tools for the Church Universal to understand the relationship between Jesus and the Father and the Spirit. And these tools were developed through creeds that were approved at councils. And in the Eastern Church, there was a group called the Cappadocian Fathers. And Evagrius was a student and a partner, a colleague of several different of the Cappadocians. And he was involved in some of these great councils as well, helping develop these Trinitarian ideas. So he's a real interesting theologian and cleric in the first part of his life. And then he had an interesting personal experience. He fell in love with a married woman. And he didn't want to fall into sin. And so he decided to become a hermit in the desert. And he went out into the desert in Egypt. He left Syria, went out into the desert in Egypt, and became a monk in the desert. And he collected the sayings of the desert fathers, some of whom lived eventually in little communities, but many of them were solitary figures. And he collected their writings in two different groupings. And so he conveyed to us something of the flavor of these interesting saints. And one of the ideas they developed was that their relationship with food and with their appetites, their physical appetites, by learning a discipline with that, it could spill over into the disciplines they needed to exercise to have other virtues. Their disciplines related to their ego and to pride. Their disciplines that were related to their relationships with other people. I think one reason Jesus fasted and exercised this discipline over his physical appetites was that such self-mastery in that area helped him in other areas. The person who trains and endures physical discomfort can then apply that discipline. If you train for a sport, if you train for music that takes hours of practice, you are becoming a disciplined person. This is interesting, isn't it? I think very interesting. The neurons that fire together, wire together, they say. So we are shaping our minds and our souls by our actual practices. And that is equipping us, it's strengthening us, so we can have greater self-control. We do this in the physical areas for the emotional and spiritual areas. Jesus needed that strength, spiritually and emotionally, because people were always setting out to trap him, to discredit him, and yet they couldn't trigger him. You know, the instance of anger which he shows in the temple is deliberate on his part. He goes to the temple. It's not a spontaneous outburst of anger. You couldn't get him. You couldn't press his buttons, as we say. Couldn't induce him into anger by baiting him. And that came, I think, from the strength he had in the disciplines he developed, partly through fasting. He overcame spiritual pressures that came with the cross and various temptations that were related to shame and suffering at the end of his life. And I think that began with and was enhanced by some of the other self-mastery that he developed earlier in his life. Let's take a moment and pray. I wonder, Lord, as people listen to this, in which area of their lives it's hardest to exercise self-control. Help us to identify that today. And then firm our will and strengthen our spine when the pressures mount and emotions run high. May we practice now for the hard moments to come. We ask it in your Son's name. Amen. Thanks for being with us this week.